Hello and welcome to the Cloud Developer channel. I'm going to start off today by showing you how to install the Windows operating system. We're going to do this by using Hyper-V 2016, and we're going to be deploying Windows 2016 Standard with desktop experience or UI. We're going to go through some very basic configurations such as enabling remote desktop to make sure we can access the server or the system that we're going to be using later on using remote desktop connectivity instead of using the Hyper-V connection console. We're going to configure time zone settings to make sure they mesh to the settings where I'm located. We're going to also go through an example of how to join that system to a domain. This is going to be using Windows Active Directory on Windows 2016 server. As well as adding an account that is a domain account that we're going to be using later on to install software and configure and do other things using that operating system. So let's get started. I'm going to go ahead and show you, this is one of my Hyper-V hosts that I have. And we're going to start off by first starting the new Windows, or I should say the new VM configuration wizard. So we're going to call this dev machine, and you can call it whatever you want. And in this case, I'm going to actually specify where I want to put that. And this location here is actually going to be specifying the location of where the machine is hosted on the actual Hyper-V host. And since I'm actually doing it remotely in my home lab, I have a different machine that I'm connecting to that Hyper-V host with. I have a drive that is specifically set up for hosting my machines, and I have a V drive that's mounted on that. So I know the folder location, it's called VMs, and I'm going to go ahead and select that. Click Next. Here I'm going to be choosing Generation 2 VM as an option. This provides newer functionality, especially from a booting perspective, some security features. They're not really necessary or relevant for the things that we're going to be doing, but typically I like using newer standards, newer technologies, so I'm going to go ahead and choose that. The next screen here is actually asking me to specify how much RAM do I want to use, and in this case I'm just going to give it 4 gigabytes of RAM. Let's use dynamic memory option. You can choose that depending on how much memory you have allocated for your VMs on that Hyper-V host. If you have a much smaller system that hosts your VMs for testing purposes, or if you're doing this at home, you might want to actually use this option, as it gives you the ability to actually have more VMs. But because I do have 128 gigabytes of RAM on my host, this is not a problem. So, and it's going to make the VM actually work a little bit faster as well. So I'm going to go ahead and choose this option and select Next. And this screen here is asking me which network card that I actually want to use. So in this case, the Hyper-V host that I have has 2 network switches, or network cards, I should say, logical switches. This is a concept that's coming from System Center Virtual Machine Manager. They have a concept of logical switches, but we don't need to worry about that. Basically treat it, or think of this as I have 2 network cards attached to that host that I can choose to attach this virtual machine to for network communication. So in this case I'm going to choose logical switch 2 and hit Next. And then here is where it's asking me how much storage do I want to have. Since this is going to be a brand new installation of an operating system, I don't really need 127 gigabytes of storage for the operating system. Typically, when you install Windows 2016, I would recommend no less than 20 gigabytes of storage, simply because as you begin to install different pieces of software and updates, you're going to quickly see you're going to be running out of space for that. And especially if you're going to start doing actual development work, you're going to want to make sure you have enough space. But what we're going to be doing here is I'm going to be provisioning the server with 40 gigabytes of space to start with initially. And then the next step is, after the machine is provisioned and configured, I'm actually going to add a secondary drive, which is going to host my software, or going to contain my software. So this way I don't have to actually use up the space on C drive to install everything. This is also useful in a case where if I need to destroy this virtual machine and I want to retain all my software and everything that was deployed on that machine, all I have to do is just simply move that VHDX file that gets produced for that other drive and attach it to another machine, and I have all of my data without having to copy and paste it from one machine to another. So I'm basically creating here the operating system drive itself, and that's it. So I'm going to hit next, and here this option is asking me what do I want to do. Basically, if you select the first option, it's going to require you to set up the settings specifically to say, boot off of a CD-ROM drive or a PXE boot network. In this case, since I know I'm going to install it off an ISO and I already have it staged on that same drive on that host, I'm just going to go select the ISO for Windows 2016 operating system here. So I'm going to choose that and then hit next. On the screen is basically a confirmation of all the different settings that I've chosen, and I'm going to go ahead and hit finish, and this is going to go ahead and actually create the machine configuration file, create the necessary folders on that machine, and is going to make it ready for me to start it up. Now, before I do that, one of the things that I like to do is I actually go into the settings here, and by default Hyper-V always defaults to one processor, which ends up being one processor or CPU and one core. And I like to typically up that to whatever makes sense for the scenario that I'm provisioning a server for. So in this case, I'm going to give it 4 CPUs, and they're going to show up as 4 separate, I believe it's cores, but we'll validate that once we get into the operating system. And then the other option that I like to enable is guest services. This actually allows your Hyper-V console to be able to better integrate with a virtual machine. If you think of VMware, basically it's the respective VMware tools that get deployed on the operating system itself to give you the ability to copy and paste easier and a couple of other enhancements. And another option I tend to change as well is changing the automatic stop action to shut down guest operating system. And what that allows me to do is anytime when the Hyper-V host actually shuts down, instead of actually doing a saving of the state or hard power cycling down the machine, in this case the same thing as you would turn off the power to the computer, I actually like to use this option. This actually tells Hyper-V to try to gracefully shut down that virtual machine by sending it a specific command, and it actually powers it down as though I would have clicked shutdown. So choosing these options, I hit OK, and I'm going to go ahead and hit connect. And here you're going to see I have a console open now, and it's telling me that I can go ahead and power the machine up. So I'm going to hit start, and here it's going to tell me to press any key, which I did. I'm basically enter space, whatever you feel more comfortable with, and we're going to go through and install the operating system here. So we're going to choose all the defaults, hit next, click install, and it takes a little bit to actually come up. And this is where it's going to start asking me for the license key. This is slightly different behavior than we've seen before in Windows 2012. Here I can actually choose an option that I don't have a product key, and that's what I'm going to do right now. And here's one major change that happened between Windows 2012 and 2016. In 2012, you were able to actually install the operating system with or without the desktop experience, and you were able to either remove it or add it later on. In 2016, that is no longer an option. So you have to make sure, if you want the desktop experience, that you have to choose desktop experience as an option. Otherwise, you will not be able to actually use the GUI version of the operating system, and you would have to reinstall the server. So in this case, I'm going to hit next. And it's going to ask me to go ahead and accept a license agreement. I'm going to hit accept, hit next, And since this is a brand new installation, I simply go through and do the custom. And in terms of virtual machines, I don't bother setting any other options or carving this out any more to for example 20 gigabytes of C drive or anything like that, because I know I'm dedicating all of the space to the operating system. So I'm going to hit next, and it's going to create the default partition sizes. It creates some restore partitions and other things that it needs in order for the boot process to work correctly. So as this process continues, this is going to take a couple of minutes for it to actually finish executing. And this right now copying all the different files. And once this completes, we'll be able to actually resume the configuration process for Windows. Well, as you can see, getting the files ready for the installation completed. Installation of the features should have been done now, and the installation of all the different features. I'm going to go ahead and hit restart now. And this is going to take a couple of more seconds to actually reboot. It's going to go through a quick device detection and configuration process, which is again a fairly quick process depending on the hardware you're running on top of. And we're going to end up getting to the Windows login screen. Okay, so here's that login screen, and this is asking us for the administrator password that we're going to be using until we actually join the server to the domain. So this is important, keep this password in mind. I'm going to go ahead and set this up and press enter, and this is actually getting us to the login screen. So here I'm going to go ahead and actually log in using that password that I provided before. And here is the desktop. You can go ahead and hit yes or no depending on where you are. This actually will either enable or not enable the ability for other servers in your server to actually discover other servers on your network. Typically in an enterprise environment, you would probably hit no, as you probably don't want that to be happening automatically or running on your servers. So I'll just go ahead and hit no here. And on the screen, this server manager, what I typically like to do is I don't like to actually see this show up every time I log into the desktop. So I give it a moment for it to actually finish loading. And here we're going to go to server manager properties. And I'm going to go ahead and choose do not start next time when we log in. I do pin it to the taskbar so it's easier for me to access it later on. Here you could see the computer name, the fact that it's actually in a work group, not in a domain mode. The firewall is enabled. I do have remote management turned on, and this is a default setting which allows you to do things like using PowerShell remoting, but it does not have remote desktop. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and enable that option, and it just tells you basically make sure you have firewall enabled to allow the remote desktop connectivity, otherwise you will not be able to get to the server. And I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And what you can see here is because I do have enhanced session on in Hyper-V, it actually recognizes that I've enabled remote desktop, and it actually allows me to connect using the RDP protocol. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually configure it to have slightly better resolution. You know what, yeah, I'll go ahead and set it for full screen for now, and then I hit connect. So what this is going to do is actually is going to remote desktop me in essentially, and I'll go ahead and use the same password I had before. So now you can see I have the full screen capability here. So the next step I'm going to take here is I'm actually going to disable this IE enhanced security configuration. Typically you do not want to disable this on your enterprise servers, and the reason for that is because you don't actually want users to be using a browser within your enterprise to actually go and install software. Now, depending on how tight your security controls are within your organization, this might be something that you're willing to sacrifice from a security standpoint. But as you get into more enterprise data centers, this option, you typically do not want to disable it. So, and as you can see, it switched to off. And I'm also going to go ahead and change the time zone. And the time zone I'm actually in is the Eastern time zone. So it's right here, and I should be pretty much ready to go. So at this point, the next steps that I wanted to take was to actually put this computer on a domain, and also add the domain account to this computer for me to be able to log in. So I'm going to go ahead and hit change. I'm going to give this the same name as the machine that was on before, and I'm going to configure it for the domain that I'm on. Sometimes you get this setting or this problem, and this is actually a good issue to show you because my computer is actually, or my VM is actually on the network and requires DNS server to be able to connect to it. So I first have to actually point it to a DNS server that domain is using. So in my case, it's going to be 192.168.1.3. And then once I do that, I'm able to hit OK here. And as you can see, now it's actually asking me for the domain account credentials that allow me to join the computer to domain. So I'm going to use the administrator account, and we're good. So now in order for this to work, I have to actually restart the computer, and I'll go ahead and do that now. So the server is rebooting, and now I should be able to actually log in using the domain credentials. So actually for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to log in as the local administrator account, and I'm going to add the domain account as a local administrator that we'll be using in the future. So I do this by going to the administrators, and I have an account called dev. And because I'm logged in as a local administrator, I need to actually give it credentials that can be connected to the domain itself. Okay, and now that I have that set up, I'm gonna go ahead and sign out and log back in, and in here I'm gonna be using this account. Okay, so now that I'm logging in, so now we have our computer. So the next step I'm going to take is I'm actually going to enable a desktop icon. This is something I typically like to do to make it easier for me to get to different parts of the computer, and that is adding the computer icon. So, and as you can see now, I have my C drive. It's actually using up roughly 10 gigabytes, well, 9.5 gigabytes for C drive already for the Windows operating system itself. And the next step I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to add another drive to this, where we're going to be installing all of the software and putting all of the binaries on. So, and you do this by going back to settings, and under the SCSI controller, I'm going to add another hard drive here by clicking this new button I'm gonna go ahead and create a dynamically expanding disk size. And what this means is that even though I set up, let's say 100 gigabytes for storage, it's not going to actually use it until I put enough data on it to actually take that space. So here what I'm going to do is I'll use a name convention of dev machine underscore data. This is a typical naming convention that I like to use for naming different drives. Specifically, these are the VHDX files. And I'm going to also specify where I want to store this. And this is going to be under the dev machine. And here I'm going to choose virtual hard disks, and this is the folder it's going to store it under. Here I'm going to give it 100 gigabytes of space and hit OK or finish, hit apply. Now if I go back to my virtual machine, as you can see, you do not actually see it appear in Windows. The reason for that is because even though it is now available to the operating system, it is not actually configured to be used by Windows yet. And this is the same as you plugging in a hard drive that is not formatted, not partitioned. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to disk management, and under disk management you can see that I have a disk that showed up now. So I'm going to go ahead and bring it online, and then once it's online I go ahead and right click again and click initialize disk. I'm going to select GPT, and here now I have a physical disk essentially, at least that's what it looks like to the VM, and available for me to create a partition on. So I'm going to go ahead and actually create this simple volume. And so one of the things you'll notice is that it's actually saying assign the following drive letter. So I typically like to actually give it D drive for my data drive, just some of the standards that I've been following. But the reason why I can't do that is because we have the CD-ROM drive that's actually using that. So I'm going to go ahead and right click and change the drive letter here, and I'll change it to something like E drive. And go ahead and hit yes, as I'm not using that right now for anything. And now I'm going to be able to actually choose D drive here for that data drive. So I'll call it data. I'll set the defaults here and perform quick format. And once I hit finish, you'll notice that now I have a data drive show up. So that's pretty much it, and now I'm ready to actually go ahead and start putting files and installing software on this operating system.